Maya Carter stood at Gate 47 of John F. Kennedy International Airport,
Oh my
holding a
God,
boarding
what are you
pass that represented
doing?
everything she had worked for. 22 years old, fresh out of Columbia University with a degree in international
Please don't
relations,
do
she was
this.
hours away from stepping into her dream. A year-long
I've been
internship with the
saving
Global
for
Education Equity
months.
Initiative in Paris. The acceptance letter had arrived 6 months earlier, and she had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. Her mother, Carol, a single parent who had spent 30 years as a night shift nurse at Mount Sinai, had cried when Maya showed her
It's
the letter.
time to
Not tears of
dismantle the
sadness, but the
systems
kind that
that
come
have
from watching
failed us
someone you
for
raised
far
alone
too
reach for something
long.
you could only imagine. The morning light filtered through the terminal's tall
Transportation
windows,
is not a
casting long
privilege, it's a
rectangles of gold across
fundamental
the polished
right.
floor.
It's the
Maya adjusted the strap
lifeline
of her
that connects
carry-on, a navy
communities
blue
to
duffel her mother had bought her
opportunities.
for graduation. Inside were carefully folded clothes, a French dictionary with highlighted phrases, and a framed photograph of her and her mother from the graduation ceremony. Carol had taken an extra shift to help pay for Maya's visa fees, and Maya had promised to send photos every week. The gate area hummed with the familiar sounds of departure: rolling luggage wheels, boarding announcements in multiple languages, children asking their parents how much longer until they could get on the plane. Maya had arrived 3 hours early, as her mother had insisted. Carol had driven her to the airport in their old Honda Civic, the one with the broken air conditioning and the check engine light that never went off. They had sat in the departures lane for 10 minutes, neither one wanting to say goodbye. Her mother had gripped the steering wheel with both hands and finally turned to face her. Her voice was steady, the same steady voice she used when Maya was 8 and came home crying because a teacher had accused her of cheating on a test she had actually studied all night for. Carol had said then what she said now. Never let them break your dignity. You hear me, baby? They can take a lot of things from you, but dignity is yours to keep or give away. Don't you ever give it away. Maya had nodded, kissed her mother's cheek, and stepped out into the morning air. Now, standing in line at the gate, she felt that conversation pulsing in her chest like a second heartbeat. The other passengers around her looked relaxed, some scrolling through their phones, others sipping coffee from paper cups. A middle-aged couple ahead of her discussed which museum they would visit first. A young man in a business suit talked on his phone about a merger. Maya found herself smiling, imagining what her first week in Paris would be like. She would walk along the Seine at sunset. She would practice her French with patient shopkeepers. She would prove to herself and everyone who had ever doubted her that she belonged in rooms where people made decisions that changed lives. The boarding process began with a crackle of static from the intercom. First-class passengers moved forward, then families with small children. Maya stood with the group waiting for rows 20 through 35. Her passport was in her hand, the navy cover slightly worn from the fingerprints of immigration officers who had stamped it during a college trip to Montreal 2 years earlier. She had checked it 4 times that morning to make sure everything was in order. Her photo, her full legal name Maya Elizabeth Carter, the expiration date still 3 years away. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. The gate agent stood behind the podium, a white woman in her 50s with short blonde hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Her name tag read Sandra Morrison. She processed passengers with mechanical efficiency, barely making eye contact, scanning boarding passes, and waving people through with the same repeating gesture. Maya watched her for a moment, noting the tightness around her mouth, the way her eyes seemed to look through people rather than at them. When Maya's turn came, she stepped forward and offered her boarding pass and passport with a polite smile. Sandra Morrison took the documents without returning the smile. She scanned the boarding pass, and the system beeped its approval. Then she opened the passport, looked at the photo, looked up at Maya, looked back at the photo. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She held the passport up to the light as if checking for forgeries, even though the scanner had already verified its authenticity. Maya felt her stomach tighten, a familiar sensation she had learned to recognize over the years. It was the feeling of being seen not as an individual but as a problem to be solved or a question to be answered. Is there an issue? Maya asked quietly, keeping her voice level. Sandra did not respond immediately. Instead, she turned to her colleague, a younger man with a company lanyard around his neck, and said something Maya could not hear. The man glanced at Maya, shrugged, and returned to his screen. Sandra closed the passport with more force than necessary, and looked directly at Maya for the first time. Her expression was cold, almost bored. Step aside, please, Sandra said. Random security check. Maya felt the eyes of everyone behind her shift in her direction. Heat rose to her face, but she nodded and moved to the side of the podium as instructed. The line continued moving. Passengers filed past her, some with brief glances of curiosity, most looking away. Maya stood with her hands folded in front of her, trying to appear calm while her heart hammered against her ribs. She had read articles about this, heard stories from friends who had been pulled aside for random checks that never seemed quite random. But she had never imagined it would happen to her, not today, not on the most important journey of her life. Sandra finished processing the remaining passengers in line, then picked up a phone and made a brief call. 2 minutes passed. Then 5. Maya shifted her weight from one foot to the other, glancing at the departure board. Her flight was boarding, and she was standing still. A security officer arrived, a tall man in a dark uniform with a radio clipped to his belt. Sandra handed him Maya's passport and boarding pass and said something in a low voice. The officer examined the documents, looked at Maya with an expression that gave nothing away, and then handed them back to Sandra. "She's clear," the officer said, and walked away. Sandra held the documents in her hand. For a moment, Maya thought this nightmare was over, that she would get her passport back and be allowed to board like everyone else. But Sandra did not extend her hand. Instead, she glanced at the trash bin beside the podium, a tall cylindrical container lined with a black plastic bag. Then, in a motion so casual it seemed rehearsed, Sandra dropped Maya's passport into the bin. The document disappeared among crumpled napkins and empty coffee cups. "Next passenger," Sandra said, her voice flat, as if nothing had happened. Maya stared at the trash bin, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. The other passengers who had gathered for the next boarding group shuffled forward, stepping around her. No one said anything. No one asked if she was all right. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, persistent hum. The intercom announced a gate change for a flight to London. Somewhere behind her, a child laughed. And Maya stood frozen, her hands trembling, her breath coming in shallow pulls. She looked at Sandra, who was now scanning the boarding pass of an elderly man in a tweed jacket, acting as though Maya had ceased to exist. The words her mother had spoken that morning echoed in her mind. "Never let them break your dignity." But in this moment, standing in front of dozens of strangers who chose to look away, Maya felt something inside her crack. Not break, but crack. And through that crack, came something unexpected. Not fear, not shame. Rage. Clear, focused, undeniable rage. Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Her fingers shook as she unlocked the screen, but her mind was crystal clear. She opened the camera, switched it to video mode, and raised the phone so the lens captured Sandra Morrison's face and the trash bin beside her. Then Maya spoke, her voice louder than she had ever used in public, loud enough that people in the neighboring gates turned to look. "This is what discrimination looks like in 2025. The words hung in the air like smoke. Sandra's head snapped up, her eyes wide, her mouth opening in protest. But Maya did not stop. She kept the camera steady, kept her voice steady, even as tears started to slide down her cheeks. She narrated what had just happened. The random security check, the cleared documents, the passport thrown away like garbage. She said her name, her destination, the name of the airline. She spoke directly to the camera, but her words were for everyone watching, everyone who would watch later, everyone who had ever been made to feel like they did not belong. Passengers stopped moving. Some pulled out their own phones. A woman in a red scarf gasped audibly. A man in a pilot's uniform walking past slowed his steps and frowned. Sandra stammered something about airline policy and unauthorized recording, but her voice had lost its authority. A supervisor appeared, a man in a suit with a company badge, asking what was happening. Maya turned the camera toward him. "Your employee threw my passport in the trash and told me I don't belong here," Maya said. "I have it on video. And now everyone will see what you allow to happen at your gates." The supervisor's face went pale. He looked at Sandra, who shook her head frantically, and then at the trash bin. Without a word, he reached into the bin and pulled out Maya's passport, brushing off coffee grounds and a crumpled tissue. He handed it to Maya with an expression that tried to convey apology but only managed discomfort. Maya took the passport, her hand still shaking, and wiped it clean with the hem of her jacket. The document was damp and stained, but it was hers again. Security guards arrived within minutes, 3 of them, walking briskly toward the gate. The supervisor spoke to them in hushed tones, gesturing toward Maya and then toward Sandra. One of the guards, a woman with kind eyes and gray hair, approached Maya and asked her to come with them to answer a few questions. Maya's first instinct was to refuse, to demand to board her flight, but she saw the way the crowd was watching, phones out, recording everything. If she resisted, she knew how the story would be told. So she nodded, pocketed her phone, and followed the guards through the terminal. They led her to a small office with white walls and no windows, the kind of room designed to make people uncomfortable. A metal desk, 2 plastic chairs, a flickering fluorescent light. One of the guards, a younger man with a crew cut, asked Maya to explain what happened. She told the story calmly, without exaggeration, her voice steady, even though her hands would not stop shaking. She mentioned the video on her phone. The guards exchanged glances. The woman guard asked to see the video. Maya unlocked her phone and showed them. They watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. "We'll need to keep your phone for now," the woman guard said. "Standard procedure." Maya's heart sank, but she handed over the device. She asked if she would still make her flight. No one answered. They told her to wait, and then they left her alone in that white room with the buzzing light. Maya sat in the plastic chair and stared at the blank wall. The clock on the wall ticked forward. 10 minutes. 20. 30. Her flight was boarding, then departing, then gone. And she was still sitting in that room, wondering if she had just ruined everything by refusing to stay silent. But somewhere, outside that windowless office, something was already beginning to happen. Another passenger who had witnessed the incident had recorded the scene from a different angle. That passenger, a software engineer named David Kim traveling to Toronto, uploaded his video to the internet with the caption, "Airline employee throws black woman's passport in trash, faces no consequences." Within an hour, the video had been shared 2,000 times. Within 3 hours, it had reached 50,000 views. News outlets started picking it up. Civil rights organizations took notice. A hashtag began trending. Justice for Maya. Maya did not know any of this yet. She sat in that room, exhausted and humiliated, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. She thought about her mother, who was probably at home now, unaware that her daughter never boarded the plane. She thought about the program coordinator in Paris, who would be expecting her arrival the next day. She thought about Sandra Morrison's face, the casual cruelty of someone who believed she would face no consequences for her actions. And she thought about the passengers who had stood there and watched, who had seen injustice happen in real time and done nothing. When the guards finally returned, they were accompanied by a man in an expensive suit, who introduced himself as the airport's director of operations. He spoke in the careful, measured tone of someone who had been briefed by lawyers. He informed Maya that the airline deeply regretted any misunderstanding that had occurred. He assured her that the matter would be investigated thoroughly. He offered her a voucher for a future flight and a hotel room for the night. Maya listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked a single question. "Will Sandra Morrison still be working tomorrow?" The director hesitated. "Personnel matters are confidential," he said. Maya stood. "Then we have nothing more to discuss." She left the office without taking the voucher. Her phone was returned to her with a warning not to share any additional footage that might compromise the investigation. Maya did not respond. She walked through the terminal, past the gates, and the shops, and the crowds of travelers who had no idea what had just happened. She found a bench near the baggage claim and finally, for the first time since Sandra Morrison had dropped her passport in that trash bin, Maya allowed herself to cry. Not quiet tears. Full, heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest, the kind of crying that leaves you hollow and raw. A woman sitting nearby offered her a tissue. Maya took it and whispered her thanks. She pulled out her phone and opened her messages. 47 missed calls from her mother. 32 text messages. Dozens of notifications from social media platforms she rarely used. Maya's hands shook as she called her mother back. Carol answered on the first ring. "Baby, where are you? I saw the video." "Oh God, Maya, I saw what they did to you." Maya closed her eyes. "I'm still at the airport, Mama. I didn't get on the plane." Her mother's voice broke. "I'm coming to get you. Don't move. I'm on my way." Maya wanted to tell her not to come, that she could take a taxi, that her mother had already done enough. But she did not have the strength to argue. She said okay, and ended the call. Then she opened the internet browser on her phone, and searched her own name. The results made her stomach turn, her face was everywhere. The video had been viewed 10 million times. News articles with headlines like "Racism at 30,000 feet and Airport Employees Shocking Act" caught on camera filled her screen. Comment sections overflowed with reactions. Some supportive, some skeptical, some outright hostile. One comment read, "She's overreacting. Gate agents deal with difficult passengers all day." Another, "I've been pulled aside for random checks. It happens. Not everything is about race." And another, "She knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted to go viral." Maya read until she could not read anymore, until the words blurred together into a single accusation. That her pain was performative, that her anger was unreasonable, that she was the problem, not the system that had thrown her passport away. She turned off her phone and sat in silence until her mother arrived an hour later, rushing through the terminal with her purse clutched to her chest and tears streaming down her face. Carol wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her without speaking. They stood like that for a long time, two women in an airport, surrounded by the noise of strangers coming and going, holding onto each other as if the world outside was trying to pull them apart. When they finally separated, Carol cupped Maya's face in her hands. "You didn't lose your passport today," Carol said, her voice fierce. "You found your voice." Maya wanted to believe her. But as they walked out of the terminal into the gray afternoon, she could not shake the feeling that speaking up had cost her more than staying silent ever would. The next 72 hours blurred together in a disorienting mix of phone calls, emails, and interviews. Journalists contacted Maya through every platform imaginable, asking for her story, her thoughts, her feelings. Civil rights attorneys offered their services pro bono. Activists invited her to speak at rallies. The airline issued a public statement expressing regret for any distress Maya had experienced, but stopped short of admitting wrongdoing. Sandra Morrison was placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation, a detail buried in the final paragraph of the airline's press release. Maya tried to return to normal life. She stayed at her mother's apartment, sleeping in her childhood bedroom with posters of Serena Williams and Misty Copeland still on the walls. She ignored most of the interview requests, speaking only to a handful of journalists who seemed genuinely interested in the broader issues rather than just the spectacle. But the attention did not fade. If anything, it intensified. Strangers recognized her on the subway, some offering words of support, others glaring with resentment. She received hundreds of messages on every platform. People thanking her for speaking up. People calling her a liar. People threatening her in language so vile she had to turn off notifications altogether. One evening, Carol found Maya sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen with an expression that worried her. Carol sat down across from her and closed the laptop gently. "What were you reading?" Carol asked. Maya shook her head. "Nothing worth repeating. Baby, you can't let strangers on the internet tell you who you are." "I'm not," Maya said. But her voice was hollow. "I just thought that if I told the truth, people would see it for what it was. But half the world thinks I'm lying, and the other half wants me to be some kind of symbol. I'm neither. I'm just tired." "Mama." Carol reached across the table and took her daughter's hands. "You know what you are. You're brave. Braver than most people will ever have to be. And that scares them, because bravery asks questions they don't want to answer." Maya looked at her mother's face, lined with years of hard work and harder choices, and felt something shift inside her. Not healing, not yet, but the faintest beginning of it. She squeezed her mother's hands and nodded. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former employee of the airline, a man named Marcus who had worked in customer service for 12 years before being let go, reached out to one of the attorneys representing Maya. He had documents, he said. Internal emails. Reports of previous incidents involving Sandra Morrison and other gate agents that had been quietly buried by management. Complaints filed by passengers of color that had been dismissed or downplayed. A pattern of behavior that the airline had known about and chosen to ignore. Maya met with Marcus and the attorneys in a conference room downtown. Marcus was in his 40s, soft-spoken, with graying hair and the careful demeanor of someone who had been burned before. He spread printed emails across the table, each one marked with highlighted sections. Maya read through them slowly, her chest tightening with each page. One email from a supervisor to Sandra Morrison warned her about being more discreet when conducting random checks. Another email discussed settling a complaint out of court with a non-disclosure agreement. A third email referred to passengers who filed discrimination complaints as frequent flyers of the race card. "Why are you doing this?" Maya asked Marcus. He looked at her with tired eyes. "Because I reported this stuff years ago, and they fired me for it. Called it a reduction in force. I've been working as a night janitor ever since. I kept the emails because I knew one day they'd matter. I just didn't know when." The attorneys advised Maya to hold a press conference. She resisted at first, uncomfortable with the attention. Unwilling to become the face of something larger than herself. But the attorneys explained that the documents would mean nothing if they stayed buried. People needed to see her, hear her, understand that she was not some abstract victim but a real person whose life had been derailed by systemic failure. Maya agreed on one condition. She wanted to speak to other people who had experienced similar treatment. If this was going to be about more than just her, she needed their voices too. The attorneys made calls, reached out through advocacy networks, and within a week, they had found 7 other individuals willing to come forward. There was James, a black businessman who had been detained for 3 hours because a gate agent claimed his first-class ticket looked suspicious. There was Aisha, a young Muslim woman who had been asked to remove her hijab during a random security screening even though regulations did not require it. There was Carlos, a Latino man who had been told his accent made his identification questionable. Each of them had filed complaints. Each of them had been ignored. The press conference was held in a hotel ballroom packed with reporters, cameras, and microphones. Maya sat at a long table with the other 7 individuals, the attorneys flanking them. She had prepared remarks, written and rewritten them a dozen times, but when the time came to speak, she set her notes aside and spoke from memory. "My name is Maya Carter," she began, her voice steady. "3 weeks ago, a gate agent threw my passport in the trash and told me I didn't belong. Today, I'm here to tell you that this was not an isolated incident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was the result of a culture that allows discrimination to thrive as long as it stays quiet. Well, I'm done staying quiet. We're all done staying quiet." The room erupted with camera flashes. Reporters shouted questions. Maya answered as many as she could, her voice growing stronger with each response. When a reporter asked if she thought the airline would change, Maya leaned forward and spoke directly into the microphone. "Change doesn't come from hoping. It comes from demanding. And we're demanding accountability, transparency, and real consequences for those who abuse their power." The press conference made national headlines. The leaked emails were published by major news outlets. Advocacy groups organized protests outside the airline's headquarters. Shareholders began asking difficult questions at board meetings. The airline's stock price dipped. And finally, after weeks of mounting pressure, the airline announced a series of reforms: mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, an independent review board to investigate discrimination complaints, and the termination of Sandra Morrison's employment. Maya should have felt victorious. But when she heard the news, sitting in her mother's living room with the television on, she felt only exhaustion. She had won, in the sense that consequences had been imposed and policies had changed. But the cost of that victory was measured in sleepless nights, panic attacks, and a pervasive sense that the world was watching her every move, waiting for her to stumble. 2 months after the press conference, Maya received an email from the Global Education Equity Initiative in Paris. She had assumed her internship was lost, that the position had been filled by someone who actually showed up on time. But the email surprised her. The organization had followed her story. They admired her courage. They wanted to know if she was still interested in coming to Paris, and if so, they would hold the position for her as long as she needed. Maya read the email 3 times, each time expecting the words to change, to reveal some condition or caveat. But the offer was genuine. She called her mother into the room and showed her the screen. Carol read it, smiled, and said, "So when are you leaving?" "I don't know if I can," Maya said. "After everything that's happened, I don't know if I'm ready." Carol sat down beside her. "You know what I think? I think the world tried to make you small, and you refused. Now they're offering you a chance to be big again. Don't let fear take that from you." Maya thought about it for a long time. She thought about Sandra Morrison's face, the trash bin, the white room with the buzzing light. She thought about the strangers who had threatened her and the strangers who had thanked her. She thought about Marcus and James and Aisha and Carlos, people who had carried their pain in silence until someone gave them permission to speak. And she thought about her mother's words. "You didn't lose your passport. You found your voice." 3 weeks later, Maya stood in the same terminal where everything had changed. She was at a different gate this time, with a different airline, but the fluorescent lights were the same, the hum of the intercom was the same, the crowds of travelers were the same. She held her new passport, issued expedited after the damaged one was declared unusable. The photo inside showed her face, serious and composed, looking directly at the camera. As she waited to board, people began to recognize her. Some approached to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her their own stories of being made to feel invisible. Maya listened to each one, offering what comfort she could, though she still felt unqualified to be anyone's symbol of hope. A young girl, no more than 10 years old, walked up with her mother and asked if she could take a photo with Maya. Maya agreed, kneeling down so she was at the girl's eye level. The mother snapped the picture, thanked Maya, and then leaned in close. "My daughter wants to be a lawyer now," the mother whispered. "Because of you." Maya watched them walk away, the girl's hand in her mother's, and felt something she had not felt in months, the faint, fragile beginning of peace. The flight to Paris was uneventful. Maya slept most of the way, her head against the window, dreaming of nothing. When the plane landed and she walked through Charles de Gaulle Airport, no one threw her passport away. No one questioned her right to be there. She collected her luggage, passed through customs, and stepped out into the gray Parisian morning. The air smelled of rain and diesel, and fresh bread from a bakery somewhere nearby. She hailed a taxi, gave the driver the address of her temporary apartment, and watched the city unfold outside the window. Her first week in Paris was disorienting in the best way. The language barrier forced her to slow down, to think carefully before speaking, to rely on gestures and patience. The work at the Global Education Equity Initiative was challenging and meaningful, exactly what she had hoped for. She spent her days researching barriers to education in underserved communities, attending meetings with educators and policymakers, learning how systems could be dismantled and rebuilt. In the evenings, she walked along the Seine, sat at cafes with a notebook, and wrote letters to her mother describing everything she saw. But she also found herself thinking about Sandra Morrison. Not with anger, but with something closer to pity. Maya wondered what kind of life led a person to treat another human being with such contempt. She wondered if Sandra had ever considered the weight of her actions, the ripples they would create. She wondered if Sandra Morrison had learned anything, or if she had simply moved on, convinced that she had been unfairly persecuted. Maya did not have answers to those questions, and eventually, she stopped asking them. Some people change, and some people do not. All she could control was her own response, her own choice to speak or stay silent, to shrink or expand. 6 months into her time in Paris, Maya received an invitation that caught her off guard. The United Nations was hosting a summit on equality in transit, examining how discrimination manifests in airports, train stations, and other spaces of mobility. They wanted Maya to speak on a panel about her experience and the systemic changes that followed. Maya's immediate instinct was to decline. She had spent months trying to move beyond the incident, to be known for her work rather than her victimhood. But the invitation included a list of other panelists. Activists, scholars, people who had spent their entire careers fighting these battles. Maya realized that declining would be another form of silence. She accepted the invitation. The summit was held in Geneva, in a vast hall, with high ceilings and rows of seats filled with delegates from around the world. Maya sat on the stage with 5 other panelists, looking out at hundreds of faces. When it was her turn to speak, she stood and walked to the podium. She had prepared remarks again, but once more, she set them aside. "I used to think that dignity was something you were born with," Maya said. "Something inherent and unchangeable. But I've learned that dignity is something you have to fight for, every single day. Not because you lack it, but because the world will try to take it from you. The question is whether you let them." She spoke for 10 minutes, describing not just the incident but the aftermath, the doubt, the fear, the exhaustion of being turned into a symbol. She spoke about the people who had come forward after her, the pattern of abuse that had been hidden for years. She spoke about the airline's reforms and the ongoing need for accountability. And she spoke about hope, not the naive kind that assumes everything will be okay, but the hard-earned kind that comes from surviving something you thought would destroy you. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, and then the applause began. It started slowly, a few people clapping, and then it grew, filling the hall until it felt like the walls themselves were shaking. Maya returned to her seat, her heart pounding, and allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in a long time. Pride. After the summit, Maya returned to Paris. She finished her internship with honors and was offered a permanent position with the organization. She accepted. Her mother visited twice that year, and they spent weekends exploring museums and eating pastries and laughing in ways they had not laughed in years. Maya made friends, went on dates, lived a life that felt increasingly normal. But she never forgot the incident, and she never stopped working to ensure it would not happen to others. A year after the incident, Maya founded the Open Gate Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting individuals who experienced discrimination in transit spaces. The foundation provided legal assistance, mental health resources, and advocacy training. It was small at first, operating out of a shared office space with a staff of 3. But it grew steadily, funded by donations from people who had followed Maya's story and wanted to be part of the solution. One afternoon, Maya sat in her office reviewing grant applications when her assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you," the assistant said. "She didn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." Maya frowned but agreed to meet with the visitor. A moment later, a woman in her 60s walked into the office. She was white, with short gray hair and a worn coat. It took Maya a moment to recognize her, and when she did, her breath caught in her throat. Sandra Morrison stood in the doorway, looking smaller than Maya remembered. Her face was lined with exhaustion, her eyes red-rimmed. She did not sit down. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, and for a long moment, neither woman spoke. Finally, Sandra broke the silence. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice hoarse. "I don't even know if I'd forgive me." But I needed you to know that I'm sorry. I've spent the last year trying to understand why I did what I did, and the truth is, I don't have a good answer. I was angry at my life, and I took it out on you. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. Maya studied the woman in front of her. She could see the weight Sandra carried, the way shame had hollowed her out. Part of Maya wanted to tell her to leave, to refuse this attempt at absolution. But another part of her, the part that had been shaped by a year of healing and growth, understood that holding on to anger would only poison her own life. I accept your apology, Maya said slowly. But I need you to understand something. You didn't just hurt me that day. You hurt everyone who saw it happen and did nothing. You hurt everyone who's been treated the way you treated me and didn't have the resources to fight back. Your apology to me is just the beginning. You need to spend the rest of your life making sure what you did never happens again. Sandra nodded, tears streaming down her face. I will, she whispered. I promise I will. She left without another word. Maya sat alone in her office for a long time afterward, staring at the door, processing the encounter. She did not feel closure, exactly, but she felt something shift. The anger that had lived in her chest for so long loosened its grip, just a little. That evening, Maya walked through the streets of Paris as the sun set, painting the buildings in shades of gold and rose. She passed the Eiffel Tower, glowing against the darkening sky, and found herself smiling. She thought about her mother's words, about dignity and voice, and the choice to fight or surrender. She thought about the young girl who wanted to be a lawyer, about Marcus and his emails, about the 7 people who had stood beside her at that press conference. She thought about the moment Sandra Morrison had dropped her passport into the trash, and how that single act of cruelty had somehow led to this. A foundation helping hundreds of people, a career dedicated to justice, a life lived with purpose. Maya pulled out her phone and called her mother. Carol answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. Hey, baby, Carol said. How are you? Maya looked up at the sky, at the first stars beginning to appear. I'm good, Mama, she said. I'm really good. And for the first time in a long time, it was true. They tried to silence one voice. But that voice opened 1,000 gates.